from Seagate Wines once again, and we're here doing our Bordeaux series, and this is part number 3. And today we're going to talk about the right bank of Bordeaux. The right bank basically is the northern side of the river, and for all intents and purposes, it doesn't really mean the Gironde. So the Médoc on the left bank is right along the Gironde River on the northern half of, or the northern part of the city of Bordeaux, like to the north. But the right bank is pretty much exclusively the Dordogne River. Okay, so that is the northern part of where the Dordogne splits from the Gironde, from the city of Libourne, going west or east from there, okay? Just so you get an idea. For the most of the last millennium, the Dordogne was a frontier between the two halves of what we know as Bordeaux. To the east, what is now known as the right bank, Saint Emillion and Pomerol, grew up quite separately from the Médoc and Grave, and they always were in their shadows. It was not, but it wasn't until many years later, into the 20th century, that their highly distinctive wines started to really get attention that they actually deserved. The landscape of the Libournais, so that whole area surrounding the city of Libourne, it's quite unlike most of the Médoc and Entre-deux-Mers, which is what surrounds it. It's very much more dramatic in its slopes, a lot more sand, a lot more clay, less obvious gravel than elsewhere in the region. The chateaux are also much more humble. The wines of the right bank are also much more influenced by Merlot, which is responsible for the style not found in the other side of the river, which would be more Cabernet dominated. Softness and approachability are keynotes here. And in more recent vintages, a surprising amount of spice. If a Bordeaux can be described as sexy, then this is where it's coming from. All right, this region was made possible by the river port city of Libourne in the 13th century. It was developed as a citadel, and it gradually gained the monopoly over the wines from this region, as Bordeaux had the monopoly over the wines of the Médoc and Grave. Libourne remains an unspoiled country town, taking on neither the bourgeois airs of the city of Bordeaux or the tourist trappings of Saint-Emilion. This is as it's always been. The town of Saint-Emilion is about 5 kilometers away as the crow flies from Libourne, but the vineyards of Saint-Emilion start as soon as the last row of houses of Libourne stop. Saint-Emilion is a very large appellation with over 800 chateaux producing more than 30 million bottles annually of exclusively red wine. More wine is made in Saint-Emilion than in all 4 of the top communes of the Médoc, so Saint-Julien, Saint-Estèphe, Pauillac, and Margaux. It is more than all 4 of those combined, and more than all 24 village appellations of Burgundy and the Côte d'Or combined. While Saint-Emilion has the postcard quaint little town from Roman times, the grand chateaus with all of the Roman carved cellars, it also has a modernity like Chateau Valendro, which is basically just a guy's garage in the center of town, making it one of the world's most sought after wines. It is unclassified, it is only made from select grapes, and it is made by one of the world's greatest winemakers. There's less than 750 cases produced, and it sells for well over $1,000 a bottle. Some chateaus sit commanding views on the top of a hill, and others just sort of punctuate a plain and barely any indication of an incline. So where do you start? The best bet is always start in the village itself. This is the home to the original Biturica vine, which became Cabernet Franc and Cabernet Sauvignon. It's also where Ausonius planted his very first vines more than 400 years BC. Many Roman ruins remain here, including the Gallo-Roman ruins on the grounds of Chateau La Gaffelière, and many archaeological discoveries indicating that the Romans grew vines on the plateau right behind Chateau Ausone, which is named after the Roman Ausonius. Vines were planted in trenches, and then they were lined with limestone that had been carved out of nearby caves, which in turn then were used for storage. Another famous cave was dug by hand by the 8th century hermit named Emilianus, who over time simply became known as Saint Emilion. His cave and the bed that he hewn out of the rock himself with his hands can still be seen today. In 1199, King John gave Saint Emilion wealthier citizens. They were known as the Jurad, Jurad. He gave them the right to administer the region for themselves. The Jurad was responsible for the testing of all of the wines of every vintage. And in 1948, the wine growers of Saint-Emilion resurrected the Jurad for themselves as a regulatory body in order to keep watch on the quality of the wines of this region. Today, the region is separated into 3 separate sections. At the top, both in altitude and in quality, is montagne, or mountain, an area that covers the highest hill on which Saint-Emilion was built. The plateau that surrounds it is the second section, and then lastly is the côte. The limestone slopes immediately to the south, southwest, and southeast of town. To the north, there is far more clay and sand, and very few, if any, top-class producers. And then the land to the west is simply too sandy to grow quality grapes at all. Top producers on the hill, on the Montagne region, are Chateau Ausone, Bel Air, Canon, and Magdelaine. For most of this region itself, its current classifications, Saint-Emilion has 13 Premier Grand Cru Classés. Just a side note here, Saint-Emilion does not have any classified growths from the 1855 classification. So they have come up with their own classification system with the 13 Premier Grand Cru Classés, which also have 2 suffixes, but you won't find the suffixes on a bottle. This is just for their own regulatory body records. They have the suffix A, 2 of them. One is Cheval Blanc, and the other is Chateau Ausone. And then they have 11 that have the suffix B. And some of those include Chateau Angelus, which I can show you a picture of here, Chateau Bel Air, Chateau Canon, and Chateau Fisiac, and Chateau Pavie. All of these, plus more, are considered suffix B Premier Grand Cru Classé. Okay? You won't find that on a label anywhere, so don't even bother looking. After that, there are 55 Grand Cru Classé chateaus in the region. And then after that, there is 130 that simply are called Grand Cru. Now, part of the problem of this is because so many of these wineries, the chateaus are new, or fairly new, considered to be new, and they don't update the classification system. This is where you can really use your noggin. If you can get out there and try some of these wines, you will find some of these wines, like for example, our favorite. This is Chateau Tour Saint Christophe. This is just a simple Grand Cru. Okay, it is one of the 130 of the simple Grand Cru wines that are produced in Bordeaux, in Saint-Emilion. Now the problem with this is a lot of the wines that are classified the same as Chateau Tour Saint Christophe are simply not very good, whereas this wine is exceptionally good. So its ranking does not define exactly how good it is, but what it does define is how much they're allowed to charge for it. So this wine, which I think got 96 or 97 points from Robert Parker, is about, in the Bahamas, which obviously were much more expensive than other places, this is about $72, $74. okay? For example, let's find something similar that would be, here is Chateau Sautard, okay? Chateau Sautard is this is a Grand Cru Classé, okay? This is the next level up. It's a very good wine, and this is an exceptional vintage, 2016. So this wine against this wine, I would probably give them pretty even footing. I think this wine was a 96 or 97 points from Robert Parker. This wine, I think, is a 93 or 94 points from Robert Parker. The difference is 120 bucks, $74, okay? You do find great value if you go out looking for it. The problem is there are so many and they're hard to find, and you do have to go out and get them. So this is why you watch videos like this, so you can get some insider tips, okay? Cool. Now, to complicate things even further, in the late 80s, a gentleman named Jean-Luc Trunivin, he started buying up little patches of extremely good quality vines, and then he took those grapes and he started a wine called Chateau Valendro, okay? He started doing it in his garage, literally where he parked the car. In his garage, downtown Saint-Emilion, like not in the country somewhere where he had lots of space. He did it in the garage of his house in the downtown part of this old city, okay? This wine was basically modeled after a Pomerol wine called Le Pen, which is the most expensive of all of the Bordeaux wines, retailing somewhere in the range of, $4,500 to $6,000 a bottle, okay? This wine was modeled specifically after that, where he took meticulous detail into every single grape he chose and to how it was made. The quantities are tiny, always less than 750 cases. And there's been wines that came after it, like Le Dôme, Quinault l'Enclos, and Le Mondeau. All of these are the priciest wines available in the world right now, coming from Bordeaux, and not one of them has any sort of classification of any kind, just to complicate things a little bit more. Many older, more established chateaus that have classifications are now following the lead of these unclassified small production wines that are getting top dollar and making much more concentrated style with more new oak, and really making a modern style of big, intense red wines that is really popular in America and in Asia, and they're selling these wines now at much higher prices than they were before they made the switch. All right, some of the most famous of that would be Angelus, Chateau Angelus, and Chateau Pavie. Those are the bigger, the bolder wines of the older houses that they've switched to do this new modern style. Very two interesting wineries we have to discuss, okay? Two specific chateaus that share the only true gravel outcrop as opposed to the clay soil of most of Saint-Emilion. The two that sit on gravel outcrop are Chateau Fisiac and Cheval Blanc, okay? I'm sure you've heard of Cheval Blanc for sure. Fisiac is actually the older of the two, and it fell into a bad state of disrepair due to absentee owners from the late 1800s until about 1947, when it started to get back onto its feet. That's when they started to just re-evolve themselves and now are again considered a top house. However, in 1947, the same year that Fisiac just started to get started again, Cheval Blanc released what is considered to be the greatest bottle of wine that has ever been manufactured by human hands. The 1947 Cheval Blanc is legendary. It is, if you look at every list of the greatest wines ever made, and there'll be 53 Margaux, 61 Mouton Rothschild. These wines are legendary. The 1947 Cheval Blanc will always be on the top of that list. These wines are really interesting because they do not mimic Saint-Emilion wines at all. They're not typical of Saint-Emilion simply because of the gravel that they're grown on allows them to be more Cabernet-based grapes. So, for example, Cheval Blanc is 2/3 Cabernet Franc and 1/3 Merlot. Unheard of in this area. And Chateau Fisiac is 1/3 Cabernet Sauvignon, 1/3 Cabernet Franc, and 1/3 Merlot. All right, both of these wines are so unique to this area simply because of that small little patch of heavy gravel soil that allows them to create wines made from Cabernet grapes. So the dividing line between Saint-Emilion and the estates of Pomerol is hard to discern, as the boundary between different villages of Burgundy or the different villages between Saint-Emilion and Pauillac, they're all so close that you can literally walk from one to the next. No question about it. Chateau Sartan, Chateau Beauregard, L'Avangile, Petit Village, Les Conciliats, all of these are within walking distance of Saint-Emilion. Okay? But each of these wines specifically, and we'll talk about a couple more, these wines all have a very, very distinct style all their own. Pomerol is probably the most hedonistic wine in all of Bordeaux. A combination of the ironstone soil where they grow the Merlot, which makes up to 80%, and in some cases, like Chateau Gazin, 100% of the blend, and Cabernet Franc that is growing well in this area. It makes these intense flavors of black cherry and plum, coupled with earthy mineral notes that tempers these wines away from jamminess, which is what makes them really, really special. Surprisingly though, these vines are mostly produced on a completely flat, completely featureless slab of vine-covered landscape with the only occasional church spire or little modest chateau that adds any interest to the horizon at all. These neat and tidy vineyards are a novelty in Pomerol. Until the second half of the 18th century, most of this land was worked by tenant farmers who would grow mostly white grapes among other crops. And then the switch to serious winemaking began at Chateau Trochot in 1750, when the owner and pioneer Louis Frontemont tore up all of his white vines, he drained all the land and planted Cabernet Sauvignon and Malbec grapes. And he was followed by Chateau Sartan, Chateau Nénine, Chateau Gazin, Chateau Petrus, and Chateau Trotanoy over the next century. And these fine wines were made here but sold under the name of Saint-Emilion. Not until the 1980s was Pomerol featured on the labels prominently as a distinct area of appellation of control. Okay? Not until the 1980s. Due to the extreme quality of wines like Petrus, Chateau Sartan, Trotanoy, La Grange, Fleur Petrus, Clinette, L'Avangile, and the instant worldwide fame of Jacques Thiampoint's minuscule winery, La Pen, the appellation of Pomerol has become synonymous with the highest quality wine in the world. Now, they're also the most expensive. For example, Chateau Petrus will retail anywhere from $4,000 to $10,000 a bottle. Chateau Le Pen, even more. Now, Chateau Le Pen is basically, as we talked about with Valendro in Saint-Emilion, it's basically simple, hand-picked, selected grapes from around the area that one guy puts together into the ultimate blend. And I get it, so that's why the demand is high. It's also why the price is high. But sometimes you just can't justify the price. And while I would love to have Chateau Petrus in my collection, I am simply not at that level where I can afford to do so. Now, hopefully someday I will, but for right now, I'll make do with some of the wines that are in that area that are equally amazing. And one of our favorites right now is Chateau Gazin. And Gazin, especially from the 2012 vintage, which we had recently, is a 100% Merlot wine, which means it's fairly approachable in a young age, but also will age extremely long. We've also had wines from L'Avangile, from Chateau Sarton. Sarton de Mai is an amazing wine, especially from vintages like 2005 and 2003. Both were excellent wines. You can obviously get these wines from the more expensive 2009 and 2010 vintages, which are all great. I mean, every wine coming out of Bordeaux pretty much from 2009 and 2010 are all amazing. But there are definitely deals to be had if you go out there and do your research, check out vintage charts, look at what areas did the best in off vintages. And that's how you're gonna find great deals, better value, wines that are not going to break the bank. Some of them are still very expensive, but less than half of what they would be in a legend year like 2009, 2010, or the closer years 2016, 2019, and now 2020. All excellent years. 2016, 2019 being the two most expensive of the last decade. So hopefully you've learned something from all of this. If you have any questions about Bordeaux wines, where to look for them, how to find them, what you should be looking for, if you want to know the names of all of the houses in the classification, all of those kind of things, just shoot us an email or message us here on any of our video outlets, on YouTube, on Facebook, on any of these different platforms, and we're happy to help you. We love talking to you. We love hearing from you. So thank you very much for tuning in for this extended 3-part series on the wines of Bordeaux, and I hope you learned something. So have a good one. Enjoy a bottle of wine. Take care. Cheers.